Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Sorang here with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being here. The Moon Jae-in administration has doubled down on its efforts to curb rising home prices in South Korea. On September 21st, the government introduced its latest round of real estate control measures, its ninth since taking power last May.
정부는 올 연말에 2차 신규 택지를 발표하고 내년 상반기까지 주택 30만 호 공급을 위한 신규 택지를 모두 발표하겠습니다. 최근 서울 등의 이상 과열에는 주택 수급에 대한 객관적인 평가와는 달리 공급 부족에 대한 과도한 우려와 내 집 마련에 대한 불안감 확산도 일부 작용했다고 생각합니다.
The shortage of affordable housing, rising prices, and increasing price gaps between urban and rural areas have become a headache not only for South Korea, but also for many countries across the globe. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we take a closer look at South Korea's housing market and the government's real estate policies, and also how they compare to those of other countries around the world. Especially in Seoul, with its soaring apartment prices. Home prices in Seoul tend to be on the higher end when compared to a number of major cities across the globe. In your opinion, are real estate prices in Korea on the higher end or on the lower end when compared to the average income?
It's very expensive to average Korean people because you have a very unique lease system named 전세 in Korea. So 전세 means you need to pay a lot of money, deposit.
A lump sum.
Yeah. So as a result, no monthly rent. So, but in order to do this, you need to borrow a lot of money from the bank. So also it is very deeply connected with household debt issue. I think it exceeded 1,000 trillion won already. It's going to be a very big issue here in Korea.
Right. What about compared to Spain? Are house prices high compared to the average income?
There actually is a gap as well, and maybe not as big as Korea, actually. Not as big as Korea. Probably also because the disposable income is slightly higher in Spain. But there's definitely a big gap that we're seeing here. We can say that prices have literally skyrocketed in this country.
What kind of problems might such a disproportionality between income and housing prices cause to the general public?
Well, there is the general gap that is growing, that the richer, a fewer percentage or a smaller percentage of the population owns more and more, and a larger percentage of the population has less and less. And that, of course, has far-reaching effects. For example, you see a lot of, let's say, frustration with the younger generation, like hopelessness, and that people think, I'll never make it. You know, back in the days, let's say 20, 30 years ago, people would believe if I work hard, I can own my own house one day. But these days, people do the math and they say, listen, even if I work hard for 40 or 50 years, I will never be able to own that house that I'm aiming at. And I think that leads to a lot of young people kind of giving up. But I think what we're also seeing is a shift in the paradigm in a way that people are very much attached to owning a house in Korea, much more than maybe in other countries. For example, in Germany, more than 50% of the population lives with rent and is quite happy with that. But in Korea, you have to own your house because this is how you build up your wealth. This is how they learn it. You own one house, then you sell it and with a markup, and then you buy a bigger house. And so for a lot of Koreans, the real estate is number one is not a place to live, but number one is a place to invest and to create your fortune. And I think that has to shift. So younger people have to abandon maybe to some extent the idea of owning their own house, and they will have to come to the point where paying monthly rent is the way to be. And find a way to be happy with that, maybe.
I have a very interesting story.
Oh, sure.
So this is a story about my friend. So he said that there's a huge difference, Japanese investors and Korean investors. So if you make a loss in an investment, so it takes 3 generations for Japanese investors to return to the market. But it takes only 3 days for Korean investors to return to the market. So they are very aggressive. As long as they keep such a aggressive spirit, I think investment will getting larger and larger. Yeah.
Now, Anton, you mentioned that Koreans, on average, they have a stronger desire, they have a stronger attachment to owning their own houses. How does that compare to the atmosphere in Spain?
Well, actually, it's funny. In Spain, a lot of people own their own houses. Actually, a lot of importance has been placed in owning property. So still it is around, I believe, 78%. Of the people actually do a very, very high. And it's been growing. I mean, the people that rent actually have been increasing, but it's still around 22%. It's still very, very, very small percentage. So that it's actually interesting how it shifts from one country to the other. And maybe the model has to change. We've seen that, Koreans were very used to, you buy this first house, you resell it, then you move to a bigger one, you're married with kids, and then 1, 2, 3, right? All these steps, and maybe this whole blueprint has to change. Right?
Do you think it reflects a lack of investment opportunities in other areas outside of real estate in Korea?
I think so. So it is said that the ratio of property to asset is about 70% here in Korea. Yeah, it's a huge portion.
Yeah, it is. Now, Anton, statistics show that Germany has one of the lowest percentage of people living in their own houses compared to their peers in Europe. And because many Germans live in rental properties, the government has stepped in to provide supportive measures for tenants, such as imposing limits on raising rent and protecting tenants from eviction. Why do you think there's such a low percentage?
I think there are a couple of reasons. In general, what you already mentioned, if you live in Germany and if you are a tenant at a house, apartment or whatever, you are quite well protected by the law. So you can feel really safe. You don't have that feeling like, oh, gee, I might get kicked out any day now. That will just not happen. It's just not possible by law. So if somebody wants to kick you out, it's actually much more difficult than in other countries. And there are even ways that, for example, if you're pregnant or your wife is pregnant, or if you study for an exam, for example, they can't kick you out even if they want to, because you can say, I'm in a difficult situation, even if the house owner said, I would need the house for myself. So it's so first you're well protected. The second reason is that you have a lot of support from the tax system. So, for example, if you pay monthly rent, you can partially deduct that from the taxes that you pay. So it was actually, in the long run, sometimes cheaper to rent a house than to own a house. If you own a house, you have to pay tax on the house, and you can deduct so much from the tax and so on. That actually too is shifting. So in Germany, we're also seeing a shift that the people less want to rent and more want to own a house, which has a little bit to do with what we already touched upon at the point that putting your money in the bank, there's no charm in that anymore. So you need to invest somehow your money. If you don't want to lose money over time, just leaving it in the bank account, eventually it will actually decrease in value. So I think in general, also German people are shifting from renting to owning. But still, in Europe, we're the #1 country when it comes to renting. More than 50% of the population does not own a house.
Okay, so now let's move on to the idea of investment versus speculation. Where do you draw the line between those two concepts?
Well, that's a blurry line, definitely. But I think it normally comes to time lapse we're talking about. I mean, when it comes to what is actual investment, which, investment is actually a good thing for the market, and you're actually normally supplying the market with spaces that people can rent. Not everybody wants to own property. Some people want to rent it or simply can't afford it, so they rent. But when it comes to short selling, that's actually a different story, right? When you're buying property and then you're selling it very quickly, and you're doing it for the fast, nice returns, then of course that is speculation. And it's impossible to curb all speculation from the market, but when speculation grows and grows and grows, which is, I think, the case in Korea, there's been a lot of speculation going on.
So the main difference, in your opinion, is the temporal, the time difference between buying and selling. Do you,
I agree with this opinion because in Korea, even one house owner expect the price of the house to get higher, then they will sell it in a short period and buy another one. So we can call it speculation.
I think what we should not forget is that lots of people, for example, in old age. So in Korea, there is the retirement system is different, let's say, from in Germany. In Germany, if you retire after 30 or 40 years of work life, then you have a decent pension usually compared to the money that you earned before. So I don't know, it depends how long you worked and on various factors, but let's say 70 or 80% of your former income you get as pension. So basically, people can live off the money they get for the rest of their lives. But in Korea, the pension is very, very small for a lot of people. So actually, they cannot live from that money. So for a lot of people, it's kind of an investment. And I would say that's an investment that you say, like, I buy a little property and I rent it out as a shop. And from the monthly income, I actually, that's kind of my pension. So I always would say you have to look at it a little bit case by case. I think time is not the only factor. I think time is a very important factor, but it's not the only factor. Is it really a small family that tries to come by and make a own by renting out a shop or two in a small building that they bought? I think that's an investment and that should be protected. But if some rich guy or some rich company comes along and buys large proportions of real estate just to inflate the prices and stuff and make it very, very difficult for young people to find housing, then that is really, that's not good. And that's not really helping the country in the long run. And I think the government really cut down very hard on those people who speculate in this way and just drive and inflate the real estate prices.
Now, another characteristic of the South Korean real estate market is that people prefer to live in apartments, especially ones built in large clusters by major construction firms and ones that carry their own brand names for prestige. What are your thoughts on this preference for large apartments with brand names?
I think actually this is a very particular Korean thing. There's a saying even that you hate it on the outside because these condominiums, especially when you see them from a distance on daytime, don't look very attractive, right? But you hate it on the outside, you love it on the inside. The thing is that these apartments actually are mostly new construction. Quality is good, materials are good, space is very reasonable. And the birth of these condominiums, of this kind of building, was very much linked to incredible jump the economy took in Korea. I mean, it's closely linked. So literally there is an idea of status linked to these apartment condominiums. So
it's like buying a luxury item. If you buy a certain brand of apartment, it's a status symbol to an extent. Now let's talk about an issue that we haven't discussed in detail so far, is tax. The Moon government decided to hike the country's real estate tax rate. Owners of multiple homes or a single expensive property must now face a heavier tax burden. Other countries across the world are also trying to curb rising home prices by introducing new tax measures or by regulating the financial market. Do you think heavier taxes for those who own large, expensive or multiple houses is fair?
I think it makes sense, but the effectiveness might be limited because of instead of taxation burden, I don't think that people will sell their properties. So even Mr. Kim Dong-yeon, he is a finance minister. In the press conference, he said that if there is any stabilizing sign in the property market, so government swiftly make another measure.
이번 대책 발표 이후에도 시장과 계속 소통하면서 후속 조치 이행 등 철저한 관리를 해나갈 계획입니다. 만약 주택 시장이 다시 불안해지는 상황이 벌어진다면 필요한 주가 대책을 신속하게 마련하겠습니다.
So I think there's no quick fix to this problem.
Okay. Andres, your thoughts?
I actually totally agree with Sakabe-san here. Actually, you see that this new round of taxation, I think taxation increases progressive ones on capital gains make sense always, and actually are necessary to control potential bubbles. But we're talking again, is this really a measure intended for a long-term effect? Because definitely it's taking its time, and I think it's going to take its time. More taxes actually are not going to force people to sell their houses, and actually it's, I think, already forcing people to then again look into these hotspots in Seoul.
Okay, now as we mentioned earlier, home prices in Seoul have been growing at a rapid pace, especially for apartments. Now in South Korea, nearly half of the country's entire population live in the Greater Seoul area. So do you think it's inevitable that house prices in the Greater Seoul area will skyrocket because people are flocking to those areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in Japan, the huge difference between Japan and Korea, Korean high school students, so schools are designated to them, right? So in order to send their kids to better high schools, they move into the area where there is a good school. But in Japan, schools are not designated. So you can go to any school as long as you can pass the entrance exam. So there is no such a phenomenon in Japan.
I think that's one very important reason that people, I heard even of parents moving houses 3 times or so just to be next to the best primary school, then next to the best middle school, and then be next to the best high school. This kind of behavior also, of course, drives the real estate prices up near those good schools and stuff like that. Korean people are almost a little obsessed with ranking things, I think, and it's getting worse with the internet. So like everything has to be on real time and everything. So there's a continuous ranking thing going on. Which school is the best? Which apartment is the best to live in? Which university is the best? And which company is the best? But I think the main reason that we're seeing is that the whole country is so much focused on Seoul. Everything happens in Seoul, be it for whatever reason. All the money, all the politics, all the sport, all the entertainment is all here in Seoul. And that is, I think, the heart of the very problem. Because I always said, like I had a similar discussion the other day, and people said, oh yeah, we need to build more houses, and we need more houses in Seoul. There's a lack of houses. And I said, no. There is no lack of houses in this city. There are just too many people wanting into these houses. And I think that is the actual problem, because if you build more houses, even more people will come. It's a hydra, you know? You can't make it stop. So actually what you have to do is to really make sure, and I think past governments have tried that with building Sejong City, you need to decentralize Korea. If you cannot decentralize Korea, it will never stop. In Germany, for example, like companies like Siemens and like huge global companies like Adidas and Puma and all these companies, they have their headquarters in cities like 20, 30,000 people. So what in Korea would be... Is it
because prices are cheaper?
No, because they come from there originally and they wouldn't see why they should move, you know?
Okay.
There is no reason to go to Berlin or to Hamburg to be successful. You can have great workforce in the countryside, in smaller cities. And so people would also move near those smaller cities to work at these kind of prestigious companies. So I think if the government would also look a little bit on trying to prevent this kind of ranking system to take place, that it's, I don't know if you can actually forbid ranking in a way, but you should make it at least less popular in some way.
Let's take a closer look at Moon Jae-in government's real estate policies. There are proposals to build a number of new planned cities. Planned cities are not unique to South Korea, and a number of case studies can be found abroad. South Korea has constructed a number of purpose-built cities in the past in order to provide sufficient housing and curb real estate prices. Are there similar planned cities in Japan?
Before, there is the same project in Japan. So there is a very famous new town named Tama New Town, which is in the suburb of Tokyo. But recently, there is no such a project in Japan. You can see reconstruction of the area in front of stations, instead of such a building new town from the scratch.
Because Tama project didn't work, or?
It works, but because Japan is population is decreasing now, so there is another social issue, which is there is so many vacant houses in Tama, a new town.
Right.
So because of low birth rate, so another social issue was born because of it.
And what about for Spain? Are there many new towns being built there?
Every now and then, more than new towns out of scratch, is maybe new districts out of scratch. They have been built, and it has been proved that every now and then it does cool market prices. But there's also a downside to these kind of projects. Sometimes there was this very famous case in Spain when the bubble burst. A town south of Madrid in a place called Cesena. The problem with, for example, we're facing a possible bubble right now in South Korea. If you're building these places from scratch and suddenly the bubble burst, you're gonna literally get a ghost town. Nobody's gonna be able to afford buying anything. And these ghost towns will actually have the problem of people living not only in a very quiet place, but a place that actually lacks infrastructure and is going to lack a lot of investment. So, for example, in Spain, it took 10 years to literally populate this place. So it was very harsh conditions for the first, let's call them settlers, right?
Yeah.
They had barely any supermarkets, they had barely any shops. Transportation was meager. Yeah, it's sometimes there's a downside risk to these.
And like we already said, and it's the same issue we have in Korea like we have in Japan, the population is decreasing. We already have a lot of cities. Why build new cities in Korea? I think you already have a good infrastructure in place for the cities that we have, the larger cities. So I really think you have to make the rest of Korea more attractive.
Okay, all right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Do you have any final comments?
My final comment is Moon Jae-in administration is focusing on curbing speculative buying. So my opinion is, so they had better face the reality. The reality means, so people want to stay in Seoul. Then they try to provide affordable houses to young people. I think it is much better than only focusing on curbing speculative buying.
So providing housing for affordable housing for those in their 20s and 30s.
Accept the reality. People want to live in big cities.
Okay.
I think, well, many of these rounds of measures have actually already had an effect in the market outside of Seoul. I think the problem that we're facing here is Seoul. And we've been talking about it today extensively, and I think the need is actually a long-term plan to unconsolidate such a big hub as Seoul is. And this is just something that in global trends, I mean, population flows are headed towards cities. There is a real need to tackle and this huge growth of cities, prices skyrocketing. I think eventually the Seoul market will cool down by itself, actually. It can't just keep on going up and up and up. But there's a real need, I think, to unconsolidate such a big city and make these outer regions much more attractive. You know, you can actually live outside of Seoul and live a very nice, comfortable life. I think the quality of life can actually be pretty good outside of Seoul.
I would really say people have to understand housing is not anymore the way to get rich. Housing is where you live. Try find other ways to get rich. And if you can change that mentality, so then you can curb speculation. And if the way you can curb that, there are different ways, either with taxes or with regulations or something. But I think what we have to see is that Korean people rethink their thinking about housing. Think again, this is a place where you live, with you and your family, where you can find happiness, and this is your space. Don't think of it as an item to just buy and sell. And if you can change that step by step, you won't change it overnight, but if you can change that step by step, I think this whole bubble or this whole basically high prices will eventually go down.
All right, thank you for your input. Thank you for your insight. Living in a safe and comfortable home is an important part of our lives. It not only keeps us safe from the scorching heat, the bitter cold and the violent weather, but it's also a place of growth where we can bond closely together with our family members. Given the fundamental importance that homeownership plays in our lives, we're hoping for a speedy resolution to the various issues being faced by South Korea's real estate market, and that the government can provide assistance to help its citizens get through these challenging times. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.